Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Princeton Public Library, and thank you for being here for tonight's author talk with Glenn Frankel and Andrew Russell. I am Janie Herman, the manager of programming here at the Princeton Public Library, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to our community room. Tonight we are here to discuss the updated edition of Rivonia's Children, Nelson Mandela's White Comrades and Their Legacy. This book was first published in 1999, and it's recently been republished in 2024 by Blue Ear Books. And we are so thrilled to have this return of Blue Ear Books to our community room. We've had many programs featuring the books by Blue Ear Books over the years. They're a small publishing press. We'll find out more about them. And they uplift a lot of these unknown stories that are so important to history and to our humanity. And it's a real pleasure to welcome Ethan Casey here with, who's at the back of the room, who is here with the books for sale. So I'm going to introduce our speakers, and we're going to get on with the show because we have a lot to talk about. So Glenn Frankel worked for many years for the Washington Post, serving as bureau chief in London, Southern Africa, and Jerusalem, where he won the 1989 Pulitzer for international reporting. He has taught journalism at Stanford University and the University of Texas at Austin, where he directed the School of Journalism. He is the author of 5 books, has won a National Jewish Book Award, and was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. He has been a Motion Picture Academy Film Scholar and a research fellow at the Leon Levy Center for Biography at the City University of New York. As I said, Rivonia's Children, first published in 1999, has been republished in 2024, and it was a finalist for the Alan Parsons Prize, South Africa's highest honor for nonfiction. He's going to be in conversation tonight with another Blue Ear Books author, Andrew Russell, who was born in Cape Town in 1964, the year that Nelson Mandela was sent to Robben Island. He attended Bishop's College, completing his schooling in 1982. The same year, Mandela was moved off Robben Island to Pollsmoor Prison. He completed his studies at the University of Cape Town before doing his 2 years of national service, as was compulsory for all white males at the time. In July of 2018, Christo Brand, one of Nelson Mandela's former prisoner guards, asked Andrew to become his business manager, and they set out on an exciting adventure into the unknown to introduce the world to Christo and his story. Andrew is the editor of the second edition of Christo Brand's book called Doing Life with Mandela, My Prisoner, My Friend. Then in October 2023, Andrew himself published his book, The Leadership We Need, Lessons for Today from Nelson Mandela. Andrew is a passionate South African, mad keen on sports, and the proud dad of 2 children, and he's over here in North America having a little walkabout, shall we say. And so we are so happy to have Andrew here to discuss this important book with Glenn Russell. Welcome.
Thank you. Testing, testing, all working. All right, so thank you for the introduction, Janie. As Janie said, I was only 11 days old when accused number 1, Rolihlahla Mandela, stood up in the dock to deliver his final speech in his treason trial. And he ended it with these words, which I'm going to read to you. During my lifetime, I've dedicated myself to the struggle of the African people. I've fought against white domination and I've fought against black domination. I've cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. And he finished his speech with these words: "It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve, but if needs be, it is an ideal for which I'm prepared to die." Because Mandela was expecting to receive the death sentence. However, on the 11th of June, when sentencing was passed, instead of giving him the death sentence, the judge decided to sentence the accused to life imprisonment. And the next day, Nelson Mandela and the other Rivonia accused were sent to Robben Island, where he was to spend the next 18 years of his life. So fast forward, I finished school, as you heard, I went to university, I did my national service. I then started working in the tourism industry, met Christo Brandt, and then at the start of lockdown, we decided to update Christo's book. But at the same time, I had always wanted to write my own book about Nelson Mandela. And I had some books which I had read, some which I hadn't read, and I went to my shelf and I found this remarkable book called Rivonia's Children, which I had bought a few years earlier at Lily's Leaf Farm in Johannesburg. And I started reading the book, and it was just unputdownable. It was just the most remarkable book. And in the last chapter of my book, I wrote a little précis on every single book that I read while I was researching my book. And one of them was a short précis of Rivonia's Children. Ethan then published my book, read this, and thought, hang on a second, I want to find Glenn Frankel. And so Ethan then tracked down Glenn, spoke to Glenn, discovered that his book had been out of print, and the two of them got together, and we are here this evening to talk about that book. So what I want to do is to start off by asking Glenn, just to set the scene, what life was like in South Africa in the 1960s, around the time when I was born, and around when Nelson Mandela was on trial in South Africa. Glenn.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Is this working? Can everybody hear all right? I want to thank you for being here with me, and Ethan Casey in the back there, who's the publisher of Blue Arab's book, for reviving this book, which, I've written 5 books, but I haven't written any books that I've found more important to me and a better story than the story of Rivonia's Children. 1960 in South Africa, after World War II, and in Africa, many former colonies of the British, of the French, of others were beginning to stride towards independence and black majority rule. But down in South Africa, things were moving in just the opposite direction. It had the largest white population in Africa, about 3 million whites, among 13 million blacks. And when I say blacks, I mean Africans, Asians, and what they called coloreds, which were mixed white and blacks. And so they were about 18% of the country was white, but they had control of all the means of production. They weren't beholden to any particular colonial power. They were not a colony of the English. They were their own creation, and about 60% of the white population was what were called Afrikaners, who'd started coming there for a variety of reasons way back in the 17th century, and continued on, and they considered themselves the owners of the land and the owners of the means of production, and the owners of the 13 million people of color who were living there among them. And so while the rest of Africa is beginning to move into a more democratic time and getting rid of the chains of colonialism, if you will, forming their own countries, South Africa is moving in the opposite direction. And the whites had a very good life. They were in different economic classes, but a lot of whites had swimming pools, they had nice houses, they had good jobs. South Africa was thriving. It had a mixed economy, it had a lot of mineral resources, it was doing very well. And they were really not just clinging to power, but prospering. But of course, among the black population, they couldn't help but notice and were involved in, interested in what was going on in the rest of Africa. There was a rise of a national movement that actually had begun around the same kind of time as these Afrikaners, these majority of the whites, had formed their own political party. Some of them had formed their own political party around 1912 called the National Party. Some progressive, formed the African National Congress. And so these two national movements are sort of butting up against each other right from way back then. And the National Party finally gets into power in 1948. It's a really pivotal year. And they begin, all through that time, the country was relying on cheap labor. Africans generally could not vote. They had no control over their own lives. But once the National Party gets into power, it begins to codify all of these rules. We remember the South in the Jim Crow era and the codification of rules about segregation. The Afrikaners did all that and did even more. It was they called it apartheid, and it was a cradle-to-grave system. It dictated where you were born. It dictated where you grew up, where you could live, where you could go to school, what hospitals you could go to, who you could marry. The so-called Immorality Act prevented mixed marriages between blacks and whites. It dictated, again, what kind of job you could get. It dictated where you could be buried at the end of life. Everything, cradle to grave. So they're moving in that direction. And of course, meanwhile, the ANC and other people are pushing for a multiracial society, and these two groups are bumping up together hard. And what happens in the 1950s and early 60s, which is when my story begins, is that while the freedom movement, under young men like Nelson Mandela and some older leaders, are moving into a more aggressive stance, there are nationwide strikes. There are economic boycotts of white businesses. There's a boycott, there's a strike against using trains and buses, and people start walking, protests are growing. But meanwhile, the government is moving to be more repressive and harsher. Once it gets into power, first it enacts these laws, then it enacts laws about segregation, but then it enacts laws to enforce this. And so gradually, as the folks, in the freedom movement are moving more aggressively forward, South Africa, the white minority rule in South Africa is moving more and more toward a police state. And the two rub up against each other. And my story takes, we think of this as the Nelson Mandela and his comrades as blacks who fought for their independence. There was a very small group of whites who fought with them. Most of them happened to be Jewish. Some of them were communists. And they joined with Mandela and, of course, were singled out by the government for special attention because the theory there was that it was this small group of whites who were kind of pushing blacks into, rebelling when actually most blacks were very satisfied with their lot of not being able to vote, not having any rights, but, being able to get jobs occasionally in the city and everything. And so these groups were heading inevitably toward a clash. And my book explores who these people were and what happened to them. It didn't surprise me that Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu and the folks and blacks and coloreds and Asians fought for human rights. That was something they didn't have and wanted. But why did this, even a very small group of whites, fight alongside them? Again, they had good jobs. They were middle-class people. They had swimming pools. They had servants for very little money. They had American cars. They had a middle-class life, but compared favorably to our middle-class life, it was a little better in some ways. Why would they, give that up or risk all that? They had wives and children, partners and children who, they put a lot at risk. And I first got to South Africa in 1983. I was the Southern Africa correspondent for the Washington Post. And I had heard about a woman, Jewish woman, who was a professor and was teaching at Eduardo Mondlane University in Maputo in Mozambique, next door to South Africa. And in the middle of 1982, someone sent her a letter bomb, and she opened it, not knowing what it was, and she was murdered. She died. And I thought, well, this is rather strange. I mean, I knew there was a war that was beginning to go on between Mandela's movement and the government, but a woman, an academic, she didn't belong to any army. She was no threat to them. What was this about? And when I got to South Africa the next year, I met some friends of hers. I started looking into it, and I learned she was part of this small group of people. She was a Marxist. She had supported the ANC. And this got me going and interested in who these people were and why they spent why they risked so much and paid a terrible price at times to support the freedom movement in South Africa. So that's the genesis of getting involved and starting on this book.
And so when you got there in 1986, I mean, for those of you who know, that was we were at our worst in South Africa. There was a state of emergency. The country was heading towards catastrophe. It was 4 years before Nelson Mandela was released in 1990. And so that's as Glenn said, how he ended up there. And then he started writing this remarkable story and investigating more and finding out more about, as he said, the small group of white folk who were actually fighting against apartheid, which many people assumed it was only the blacks who were fighting against apartheid. So here was Glenn to write this remarkable book. Maybe just a little bit more about the book and those characters, maybe just you know, the chief characters and what was the main focus of them, and what struck you the most about them?
Well, as I say, I actually got there in '83. I met some friends of Ruth who had known her when she had been there. I found out she'd been a journalist in South Africa for many years. She'd been imprisoned in 1963. Let's go back a little bit. I mean, all through the 50s, as I said, there were demonstrations, there were efforts against the government. And meanwhile, the government is learning how to become a police state. The government actually sends its policemen and security officials up to French-run Algeria to get trained into torturing detainees, into what kind of laws they could pass. They were getting practice in suppressing this kind of thing. And they were passing laws like the Suppression of Communism Act, which not only affected communists, but liberals, you know, outlawing of political parties, declaring, they arrested 150 people at one point and put them on trial for treason, and a treason trial that went on for 3 years. Everyone, ultimately, the charges were dismissed, but the amount of time and effort, banning people, they started requiring that people stay in their houses. They could go to work during the day. They had to report to a police station every day. I mean, they were beginning to crack down, and there was torture. There were other things going on. So gradually, this repression was continuing to the point where eventually Mandela and his comrades, both white and black, decided that they would have to move from nonviolent Martin Luther King type demonstrations into something different. And they organized a sabotage campaign. And some of them went underground. And Mandela himself left the country and traveled around Europe and Africa looking for support and money. The Soviet Union was one of the few places that offered them support. The United States was not only not interested, but the CIA and the Americans were very much supporting the government in South Africa. The white South African government liked to compare itself to the United States, saying, we're a pioneering society just like you once were, and we represent Western civilization and values here against these hordes that are being led by these communists and who are out to destroy what we have. And the United States was helpful to the government in South Africa. So what you have is a situation where these two sides are clashing. After what was called the Sharpeville Massacre in 1960, where a bunch of demonstrators were shot at in what, 70, 90?
Yeah.
Were murdered in the streets in this black township outside of Johannesburg, south of Johannesburg. The ANC goes underground. It's banned by the government, but it doesn't stop existing. They buy, and with the help of this small group of white communists who have access to money and they're lawyers, they're businessmen, they buy a farm up a little bit north of Johannesburg called Lily's Leaf Farm. They pretend it's being bought by just one businessman for a retreat, for a place for him to live with his family. But actually, they begin organizing a sabotage campaign from there. Mandela, when he returns from overseas, spends time there secretly under an assumed name. There are others who are there full-time, coming and going. And they're organizing first a sabotage campaign that begins in December 1961. They think they're going to bring the government to its senses by doing things like blowing up electricity pylons, railroad tracks, various things. They're not going to kill anybody. These are like gentlemen terrorists.
Yeah.
You know, the last thing they want to do is kill anyone, but they've run out of options. And as you can imagine, this thing actually doesn't bring anyone to its senses in the government. In fact, it makes the crackdown stronger. And the government passes a terrorism act, and it passes a sabotage act that basically rules that you can get the death penalty if you're convicted of political sabotage. Then they do the 90-day detention act, which is something they'd learned from the British. Lock you up for 90 days with no charge, no right to see a lawyer, no idea what's going on. And after the 90 days, they can renew it for 90 days. And they can keep renewing it, and they can keep questioning you, and they can beat you in prison. They can do what they want with you because you have essentially no rights once you're arrested. So this thing is getting stronger and stronger. The radical folks, white and black, are meeting in this farm. They're, as I say, not just gentlemen terrorists, but they're, I'm afraid, amateurs. Extreme amateurs. They're formulating a plan maybe to launch a real guerrilla war fashioned after Castro, what Castro did in Cuba. They really have no idea what they're up against. And once the police find out that this farm is being used as a headquarters, the police come and raid it. They arrest, about 15 people at that time. They arrest their wives, some of their children. Some of them are later released. Others are added. They capture Mandela, actually a little bit before this. They've caught him after he gets back. They've already sentenced him to 5 years, and now they're going to put him on trial for sabotage, which is punishable. It's a new law, punishable by death. And he and about 11 of his comrades, 11 altogether, 4 of them are white. All of them are of Jewish background. They go on trial in later that year in 1963 for sabotage. And they face the death penalty if they're convicted.
So talk to us about one of those, the one who was released, the one who you met and interviewed, and how he managed to get, how he managed to escape the sentence.
Well, you quoted from Nelson Mandela's statement.
Yeah.
He gives a statement from the dock. He doesn't testify, so he can't be questioned by the prosecution. But he gives a statement from the dock explaining all the things we just talked about, actually, why he's done this, and in the end, he almost invites to be sentenced to death, and he fully expects to be sentenced to death. The others appear and give testimony, and one of those is a man named Rusty Bernstein, a white communist, Jewish background, and he also, well, you have to understand when these people were arrested at Lily's Leaf, then they were put in isolation for 90 days each, and it's only after the 88th day that they're charged, and so they're released from isolation and they're put in normal prison conditions. And Rusty, during all that time, has been writing little notes to his wife, Hilda. He's not allowed to see her or anyone, but they're allowed to do his laundry. So on these, on his shirt, he takes out his shirt collars out of the middle of his shirt, and he writes little messages to her about how he's feeling. I met Rusty and Hilda many years later in 1995. They were living in the UK. They'd been released. They'd fled. Rusty had gotten out, had been found not guilty, skipped bail for another charge, because, of course, they immediately tried to rearrest him, escaped the country. And once I decided to write about these people, I looked up some of them and I got to know them. And this is in the 90s. They were in their 60s, early 70s. They were people who had gone through horrible times. Their friend Ruth first had been murdered. Another leader of the group sentenced to life in prison. Mandela had spent all those years. By the time I got to him, of course, South Africa was a democratically elected free country at last, and they were very proud of their role in that. But nonetheless, they felt a little bit overlooked, a little bit like they had sacrificed a lot. And so they were a very interesting group to talk to. And I found them among the most courageous people I'd ever met. And my question to them was, why? Why did you do this? I mean, the risks were so great. They had 4 children when they were arrested. When Rusty was arrested, his 4 children were left with his wife, Hilda, who was also very implicated in the politics, and she was under surveillance. And so, how many of us would do something like that in those circumstances? And gradually, in talking to them, came to understand how important their political beliefs were, their Marxism. It was almost like their religion. They believed they were on the right side of history and that inevitably they would be exonerated. Equally important, they didn't understand how bad the state was getting, how much in danger they were. They had started out as kind of, progressive radicals in the 50s going to demonstrations. But as time went on, it got to be more and more dangerous, and they faced a terrible choice. Do they abandon their friends? Do they abandon Mandela and Walter Sisulu and people who are struggling against this to their own fate, or do they stick with it? And so they each step they find themselves getting deeper and deeper. It's a terrible analogy, but you think of when they talk about putting a frog in a, you know, in water and then turning on the fire underneath the pan, and slowly it gets hotter and hotter, and the frog doesn't realize it until it's too late. That's the situation they found themselves in. And when Rusty's sitting in prison for 90 days with access to no one, certainly no lawyer, no books, and he's writing these little notes, he begins to realize what a mess he's made and how dangerous things are, not only for him, who faces, you know, hanging if he's convicted, but what he's done to his family, what he's done to his 4 children. And, you know, it was a horrifying moment in his life and in their life, and the fear and the sense that they were all going to die, essentially, or be forced to leave, was intense. And I've never met a group of people who I found so courageous and at the same time who were so interested in talking about what had turned out to be the most important and dangerous moment in their lives, that they'd survived, though some of their friends had not survived it. And for someone like me who, you know, I've interviewed a lot of people over the years. I've written 5 books. I never met a group of people who I found more compelling than these folks. And I felt really honored to tell their story.
Talk to us about Bram Fischer, who was another character who you know, tell us a little bit about him and his role that he played in the whole.
So Bram was a lawyer, and unlike these folks, who are mostly, as I said, a number of them are Jewish. Almost all of them have come from Lithuania or Latvia during the same time that so many hundreds of thousands of Jews came to the United States and to the UK. About 100,000 people came to South Africa and ended up there. They're a very small part of the white. They're a minority of a minority. They're a very small part, but they do well in the usual professions. They're lawyers and other things. A number of them are radicals. A number of them come from the socialist movement, you know, that's beginning to move into Russia and into these states. And they come down and they practice their politics in South Africa. And so they were an interesting group to see. There were very few Afrikaners. Remember, that's the majority group of whites who come from Western Europe, from the Netherlands, from different places. They come to South Africa all through the course of history, sometimes escaping religious persecution, sometimes to make money. They form their own culture. It's very, very rare that any of them move into the freedom movement, into the Black freedom movement. One who did was a lawyer named Abram Fisher. He's the son of the president of one of the states of South Africa, so he's royalty, really. And he becomes a communist. He's an idealist. He realizes he's a racist, and he rebels against it. And so he gets involved. He's not arrested at Lily's Leaf Farm with the others. He wasn't there that day, though God knows he was there many other days. So he becomes their chief lawyer and tries to protect them. And of course, most of them are found guilty and sentenced to life in Robben Island. And then the government comes after him. And he can escape for a while. He's got a legal case up in the UK that he needs to pursue. And even though the Afrikaner government, even though they're cracking down on everyone, they really would like Bram Fischer just to be out of the way. And they allow him to go to the UK, where his comrades, with people like Rusty and some of the others who are in exile, try to convince him to stay in the UK, and he refuses. And his line about that is, "It's my country. If all the blacks see that we've all fled, and that we're fine up in the UK, and we've left them to their fate, and we've left Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu and these wonderful men in prison for life, what is that? What is that?" So he goes back to South Africa, he breaks bail, he goes underground, he changes his look, he grows a goatee, he looks kind of ridiculous, as he himself points out. At one point he dresses as a woman so he can go into a police station and do he's like the Pimpernel, the Scarlet Pimpernel, for about 6-8 months. Then they catch him. They have to torture one of his friends to find out where he is, but they do. And they catch him, and they try him, and they sentence him to life imprisonment. And they isolate him, and eventually he develops cancer, which they don't treat for the longest time, and he dies in prison.
Glenn, the prosecutor in that case as well.
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit, because you got to interview him, the guy who was prosecuting the Rivonia accused.
So because many of these whites were from Jewish background, I don't want, who fought alongside Mandela, I don't want you to get the impression that most Jews did that. Most Jews, to generalize, kind of went along. They sometimes voted for a liberal, like a woman named Helen Suzman, who was the only liberal in the South African parliament for many years. And Helen, who I got to know, and another wonderful, interesting, really tough person, was Jewish and very proud of it. But most Jews went along, and then there were some folks who went along with the regime. And one of them, who I got to meet and interview, was a guy named Percy Uttar, who also a lawyer, Orthodox Jewish background. Percy was a very ambitious guy who there's a lot of anti-Semitism among this Afrikaner group for many years, these people, and Percy fought that and was very ambitious and eventually rose to a position of prosecutor. And he became the chief prosecutor of these guys at the Rivonia trial. He was Nelson Mandela's chief prosecutor. And he felt it was his role to protect the Jewish community by showing the Afrikaner white majority, small white group, that Jews were just as loyal as anyone else. And so he went out of his way to make it as hard on these guys as possible. Very bombastic, very intelligent, very successful. And he got them convicted, which wasn't hard to do since they were all pretty guilty, and then argued for them to get the death penalty. Only in the end, the judge, who, for reasons that were never quite clear, the man was an older judge. He'd been around before the apartheid judicial system had really clicked in. And he may have been a little bit offended by it, though he didn't make that clear at all. In the end, he didn't sentence them to die. He sentenced them to life in prison, which was a surprise. We never really know. He never left any record of it. Percy survived to become the first Jewish Attorney General of the Transvaal, the biggest state in South Africa at that point. So he achieved his career goals and his reputation as a tough, unflinching supporter of the regime. And he went on in life. And when I got there, and started interviewing people for the book, I approached Percy. He was 86 years old. It was a little hard to get him to talk to me at first because he was wary. He'd never really, since the end of the regime, he'd given no interviews whatsoever. It was a little embarrassing to be the guy who had gotten Nelson Mandela sentenced to life in the new South Africa, where Nelson Mandela was now the ultimate national hero. But I gradually convinced him that I would try to be fair. I never lied to him. I never told him I was going to be supportive. At that point, I'd been a writer for a long time, and I had decided over many years that it's better just to tell the truth. It's easier to keep track of, and you don't fool anybody. And, it worked eventually. I met he sent me to hang out with his son for a day. I gave him my book about Israel that I'd written. He was a very strong Zionist. Eventually Percy decided that I was a safe person to talk to. I wanted to know, and he wanted to convince me of something, which is that by charging them with sabotage rather than treason, he was the one who kind of indicated to the judge that they shouldn't get the death sentence. He saved Nelson Mandela's life. And he stuck to that line all through our interview. And I, well, Percy, that's not what so-and-so says. And, and there were reasons to charge them with sabotage. It was one of the new kind of charges that the police state had developed. It was easier to prove. It had a death penalty on it. Percy insisted. I never got anyone to back up what he had to say. And finally, at the end of our interview, he looks at me, and because he knows I'm not really behind this. At one point, I'd stop the tape even. I'd say, look, Percy, because he denied he had any ambitions, that he'd done this trial because he wanted to be the Attorney General, or it was all just doing his duty. And I said, if you answer if you give me answers that I know are not true, things, it's going to be very hard for this interview to continue. You've got to, tell me why you did this. Tell me what you were doing. And so he tried and he tried, but he couldn't. He could never get past his story. And he turns to me at the end and he said, well, Glenn, you do believe me, don't you, that I was trying to save Mandela's life? And I just kind of looked at him and said, well, Percy, I believe that you believe it. And because I believe at that point at 86, he did believe it. And Nelson Mandela, being the kind of person he was, had Percy to lunch one day. And then had when he was president of South Africa, Mandela, and told the gathering press afterwards, I think he was only doing his duty. The others, Walter Sisulu, these are the people who were tried at Rivonia. I won't name all of them, but Walter Sisulu was Nelson Mandela's close friend and mentor. And Ahmed Kathrada, the man with the little mustache, was another one who spent 20 years, they spent 25 years together, first on Robben Island and then at Pollsmoor Prison. They hated the idea that he had lunch with Percy. They just couldn't believe it, that this guy. Anyway, Nelson Mandela forgave him, and that was a big moment for Percy. It allowed him to feel. So again, for me, to be able to talk to these people and talk to him too, it was just. It was a marvelous experience. It covered the ground between who went along with this, who believed in this, and who fought it, and what their attitudes were and what happened to them. I feel very fortunate to have met these folks and to have been able to get to know them. With a couple of these families, I got to be very close over the years afterwards. They're all gone now. Their children are still around, and I'm in touch with some of them. But everyone who was involved in this, who I met at the time, is passed away, and I'm glad I got to meet them and to capture in this story. And it's a pretty dramatic story. There's a prison break. There's a few other things going on in the middle of it, and there's this trial, which is just an extraordinary moment. And so there you are.
I think before we take questions from anyone, any thoughts on Mandela's recollections or reflections when he was freed back in South Africa as president about the small group of people who helped him? Did you ever find out or hear more about what he said about them?
That's a really good point. The ANC, from the beginning, had a multiracial attitude about what the future of South Africa ought to be. However, the ANC itself was an all-black political movement for a long time. There was a separate movement for Asians, Indians, and there was a separate movement for coloreds, the mixed race group. And so they were divided kind of racially, even though the overall thing was we would be together. And the original statement of the ANC in 1955-56, the
Freedom Charter.
Yeah, the Freedom Charter, which actually was written mostly by Rusty Bernstein, one of my main characters, talks about South Africa belonging to all its people. Had a few lines in there about, belonging all the property for all the people, too. He slipped in a little Marxist moment, but that's what it was supposed to be. But of course, the ANC was rising. This time of revolution was coming when other black African countries were becoming free, and they were very much, having overthrown their white colonial oppressors or kicked out the white regimes, they were all about what was called Pan-Africanism. They were very much about black people seizing power over their own lives and government. And they weren't very interested in having white people as part of that. And so when Mandela travels around underground, when he flees for a while before coming back to the country, he's getting a lot of grief, actually, for this multiracial thing. And he comes back and says, we have to show at least that we're a black-led movement. That's an argument they have amongst themselves that never gets resolved, because then they go to prison. And when they go to prison, incidentally, all the blacks go to Robben Island. All the whites are serving their terms in a prison in Pretoria. They're as I say, right till death, apartheid keeps you apart and makes sure you don't share anything together. But when Mandela gets out, he's an advocate of multiracialism, of a non-racial society, really. And one of his arguments is that even though most white people, went along with apartheid and oppression, there was this handful of people. He included Helen Sussman in that too, though she was not part of the movement per se. There were a handful of people who fought for us, who fought with us for a multiracial society. And because they did that, I'm not willing to condemn all white people, you know, or any white people. Everybody has to have a chance to participate in a new democratic South Africa. A lot of problems, and a lot of things didn't come to pass. But the multiracialism part of it and the belief, they have a much stronger democratic constitution than it seems we have in the United States at the moment. They don't have an electoral college, for example, and they have many other things. So at least on paper and in the hearts of people like Nelson Mandela, there were whites who were important parts of their movement, and that allowed them. And so my people, the people I write about, took great honor in that, and they were there when Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as president. They had a couple of seats near the front. There are photos of them together. We've got some photos. This is Hilda Bernstein with Mandela at one of Hilda's birthday parties. That's Rusty, her husband, next to her. And Ronnie Kasserel is one of the great communist agitators to the side. This was a multiracial movement. These people were white.
In the photograph there?
I'm sorry. So that's Nelson Mandela, of course. This is Hilda Bernstein and her husband, Rusty. Rusty was tried at the Rivonia trial. He was acquitted, whereas everyone else was found guilty.
Who's in the other picture that you had up
Yes.
there, too?
Yes. This is Rusty Bernstein.
He's one of the...
Lionel Rusty Bernstein was his name. This is Rusty when they let him out after the trial, when he was released on bail and before they fled the country. And that's his wife, Hilda Bernstein.
So she was in the other picture, too?
Yes. Yeah. They were married.
And they're also on the front of your book.
Correct.
They are. That same photo's there.
Their children that are on the front of the book?
Well, these children, we have the picture of Anne-Marie? Let's see. I thought we had it. Keep looking. No, we don't. Okay.
Okay.
The children with the woman in the middle with the phone, that's a woman named Anne-Marie Wolpe, and that's her daughters, Tessa and Peta. They're on the phone with her daddy, who has just broken out of prison and has escaped the country, Harold. And he's calling them from Tanzania to say, I'm safe. That's another story that I didn't go into. There's so many stories to go into. But these people were really up against it. I mean, they paid a huge price for this, to the point where Ruth First was murdered. And Bram Fischer died in prison, and others were exiled, and their children, of course. That's Ruth. That is an image actually painted in a black township. That's based on a photo that was taken of her, and that photo is in the top of this book jacket also. Ruth was a journalist. As I said earlier, she was a real thorn in the regime, but she was not a military person. Her husband, Joe Slovo, who was a lawyer in South Africa and who had escaped and became the leader of the resistance movement called Umkhonto we Sizwe, which became the chief violent movement against apartheid. They tried to get to Joe, and they couldn't. So they sent his wife a letter bomb, and they killed her instead. And then they published in the newspaper, or they leaked to South African press that Joe had actually arranged her murder because he was jealous of her, I don't know what it was, all of which was an operation put together by the South African government.
Who's Rivonia?
Rivonia is the name of the place where their secret headquarters was. It's a suburb of Johannesburg. And the trial where Nelson Mandela and the others were tried and convicted of sabotage was called the Rivonia trial. And Rivonia's children refers to these people, who they were and what they were trying to do, and how naive they were and how courageous they were.
Yeah. Are there questions from the audience?
Yeah, we should.
Yeah, we should do a few questions here. Okay, here's one right here.
Thank you, Glenn.
Glenn, that was great. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Russell. Two questions quickly. Both of you referred to a small group of white folk. How many people are we talking about, really, who were actively involved?
talking about maybe a few hundred at the most. There were not only this group that were closely tied to Mandela, there was another group that was tied with the Pan-Africanist Congress, which was the anti-Mandela movement, which was very, and had some white supporters as well. So there was a group of people there. We're talking, and then if you expand it out to people like Helen Suzman, or to people who were working, who were not violent, who were working on the surface. Someone like Alan Paton, for example, the novelist, headed the Liberal Party in South Africa. A lot of people criticize the Liberal Party as not pushing hard enough and all that, but under the circumstances, it wasn't very safe to be a member of the Liberal Party either in the early 1960s. And Paton was harassed, his house was broken into, they never put him in jail. So it depends how far you want to expand the circle. I would say couple of thousand once you get into that level, but never much compared to, the overall white population was 3 million. 60% of those were Afrikaners. 40% came from English-speaking countries, mostly from the UK. Some of them were involved in the movement, but most of them were involved in business. I mean,
there was also another movement called the Black Sash, which was a women's movement in South Africa. They were white women who protested peacefully. They wore black sashes and they would hold banners and they would protest publicly. I mean, even some of them were arrested, put in Polesville prison. One of my friends at school, one of his mom was one of the Black Sash members. So there were other people involved, not as hectically as this group, but there were others who were definitely involved.
And Black Sash put out a report every year listing as many, summing up as many cases as they could, the numbers of people arrested. They tried to keep, South Africa was such a strange place because within this little core of whites, there was an effort to pretend anyway to be a Western democracy. They had elections, and so there was a little core of that, though you could violate it quite easily and get in a lot of trouble. And as time went on, they used the law and new laws to enforce a police state even among the white community. And so it was a curious mix, which made it fascinating and scary. And, and people like the Reagan administration thought that, made the claim that they were working on reform. And then eventually they would become more of a real democracy. And curiously enough, Paul, it was the reform that got them, that really helped set off the events that caused its demise. Because they couldn't reform enough to really say, take in the people, urban blacks who were becoming the majority and who wanted to live, wanted the economic and political freedoms that went along with them living in the 20th century in cities. And they couldn't move fast enough. They didn't want to lose control. And so they sort of tripped over themselves, and very quickly after that, the regime collapsed. It was very...
Just one other quick comment. I was struck by one thing among many wonderful things that you guys were talking about. In the American Civil Rights Movement, there was always a group of white people who were fighting back strongly. They were upper middle class whites. In Montgomery, for instance, the Virginia Durr clan was a big family, and they were taking the same risks as Europe. And it's the mystery of human nature, why someone would take that kind of a risk. So I'm very eager to read this book to understand the psychology of how they could do it.
Thank you. Andrew, this is a question for you. So growing up in South Africa, how much did you learn? Did you learn about Rivonia's children as part of your curriculum? Or was this kind of a story that was like tried to be not taught in schools? Like, how much of that whole side of the apartheid movement in the Nelson Mandela school? Because you would have probably been, middle school, so this probably should have been a part of your history lessons?
So in my book, so I was what I called a privileged white growing up in South Africa, born in 1964. Until Mandela was moved off Rivonia Island in 82, we lived in an absolute bubble. And I talk about that. We had no idea what was going on right under our noses. We only got television in 1976 when I was 12 years old. There was one television news station which was run by the state. I didn't study history at school as a subject. So we were really living in a bubble. It was only towards the end of my school career that we really started understanding what was going on. I mean, it was bizarre looking back on it, that we really were in this absolute protected cocoon, and there was stuff going on around the country that we were unaware of. But that was my life. I lived under apartheid. There were beaches which said whites only, there were beaches for blacks only. On the trains, there were compartments for whites only, there were compartments for blacks only. So that's how I lived. We didn't know any better. We were in a bubble. And towards the end of my school career, I started understanding more about it. When I got to university, then universities were hotbeds of protest. I then had to do my national service for 2 years, where we had these young white military people giving us more propaganda about the black threat from within South Africa and the red threat from outside South Africa. So, to answer your question, Janie, the history, I was at a private school. We did have black kids at our school who were sponsored by corporations. So we were a mixed school where there were probably between 5 and 10% black kids in our school. But all the other better schools in my suburb were for whites-only kids, because we lived in a suburb that was only for whites. It was only from 1993, when apartheid was all abolished, that those schools opened up to all races. So, Janie, we were blissfully unaware of what was going on.
Tell about your trip to Hong Kong and Thailand.
Yeah, I was on a rugby tour. I was mad about sport. And then in my second last year of school, we went on a rugby tour. We were due to go to Argentina. Then the Falklands War happened. So we were invited to go to the Far East. And we ended up in Hong Kong. And suddenly the Hong Kong government discovered that there was a South African schoolboy rugby team on tour in Hong Kong. And we actually weren't meant to be there because we were banned from international sport. Darnie Craven, who was head of South African rugby, had kind of secretly arranged this tour. We got there, and suddenly people were coming to interview us and saying, what are you doing here? And we were going, whoa, hang on a second. I'm a 16-year-old South African. I'm on rugby tour here. Why are you having a go at me? What have I done wrong? But then we realized we were the pariahs of the world. We were actually hated by the world. There were economic sanctions. We weren't part of the United Nations. We were not welcome. And we were made to feel very unwelcome when they discovered that we were there on a schoolboy rugby tour. And that was when my bubble burst, when I came back thinking, what the hell is this all about? So that was how long it took, yeah. Yeah. It was crazy.
Okay, hang on.
How is this book? How is this book that's revised? How is it different from the one that was written before? What have you done to the book?
Not that
change
much,
it?
to be honest. I added a new introduction to update things a bit and put it in the context of the world we live in now a little more. I made a few changes toward the end and added a bit, but basically it's the same book as before because it's asking this question. Hannah Arendt, who wrote a book called, the philosopher, wrote a book called Eichmann in Jerusalem about the trial of Adolf Eichmann, and she wrestles with this question of what is it people are responsible for doing. She said a police state, its role is to take history and bury it deep in the ground and cover it up so you don't find it. And that the only honorable thing to do is to attempt to find these stories, and also that if anyone in a society refused to go along with the police state, if they refused to, in the case she was writing about, they refused to participate in the Holocaust of murdering Jews and others, and she gave a few examples. Those stories are the ones the police state wants to bury. If you uncover those and deliver them, and those stories are told, it means it's still all right for us to live in the world.
And how is this book received in South Africa today? And do you see any of the same ideas reappearing in South Africa today?
Well, Andrew would have to answer that last question. I was surprised. I mean, I wrote this book in 1998, 1999. I didn't think anyone in South Africa would be interested in having an American journalist, tell their story. So the book did okay. In America, it got published in the United Kingdom. And then it got published in South Africa, where it was a bestseller for a few weeks. And I was pretty shocked. And in explaining why that was, and I went down there and gave book talks. Helen Suzman and I did one where she introduced me, which was terrific. And she said, you know, I asked her about this, and she said, we actually don't know our own history. Mm-hmm. The history, as Hannah Arendt had suggested, had been buried in a deep hole. They didn't know what had gone on to a great extent. I mean, some people did. It was out there if you wanted to look for it. But the regime did a very good job of keeping its constituents safe, which is to say, you know, protected from the story. And so there was a group of people after Mandela's release who were interested in knowing more about what had happened. And Lily's Leaf, the farm that these guys bought, and that was raided and then shut down, and eventually it was taken over by private farmers. Eventually, the son of in the Wolpe family, the one who isn't in the photo, he was 3 months old, actually, when all this happened, and Nicholas Wolpe, after reading the book and doing a few other things, proceeded to put together a trust and bought the property and put the properties together and created a museum out of it and preserved parts of it and made an archive. Some of my papers are at this archive now. And had a lot of support, and a lot of people came to visit it. And he invited all of my characters who were still alive, the Bernsteins and others, went and visited Lily's Leaf Farm and visited Rivonia. And it became a place where, among other places in South Africa, where the history that had been lost, a couple of prisons, for example, and the Hill, and all this history was recreated in a way, was brought to the surface that people didn't know. And school children are still going to these places and learning about the past. It's a very unpleasant story. It's sort of like, you know, people in Germany learning about the Holocaust and how that went. And the struggles of these things always continue. You know, they're never finished. There's always, as there is in our country, a debate over the meaning of our history. And, you know, and it's always used for political purposes. It's always a subject, especially in times of trouble, it comes up again. So it's important to tell these stories. Each generation, I found, you know, history is just what each generation seems to make of it. And so we have to retell these stories over and over again if we're going to understand who we are and where we came from. And that's how people look at it.
Just to add, I mean, I think for South Africans to learn about this part of our history, to learn about these people who were involved in the struggle, and it was kept quiet, and it took a man like Glenn to uncover it and to publish the book and to make South Africans aware of these small groups of pockets of people who were incredible heroes, you know, which we never knew about. And I think the world needs heroes right now, you know, and so if these people could make such a difference and have such an impact, to the outside world, they shouldn't have been in the same camp as Mandela because they didn't look the same, or, you know, but they were different, but they believed the same thing. And they were heroes. They were true heroes. And I think it's an incredibly important story. And I think it's, you know, now is a great time for Ethan and Glenn to republish the book.
Thank you. I think so too. I think that's a perfect way to end this talk, perfect message that the world needs more heroes and needs more people to stand up. And, you know, I think it takes the stories being told, and sometimes it does take things, you know, we are seeing a shift in how our media is working and how things are published and generated, and the importance of, you know, independent bookstores, the importance of the small press, the importance of this to keep these stories going can't be overstated. So I want to thank you guys both for coming here. So we do have Ethan at the back, and he has Rivonia's Children there for signing, but we also have Andrew's book there about leadership lessons from Nelson Mandela. And I think, Ethan, do you also have the book there, the Christo Brand book? Yeah, so that's the story that if you actually go into the library's YouTube channel, at one point during lockdown, this is when I first met Andrew, he did a Zoom call with Christo Brand, who was Nelson Mandela's prison guard on Robben Island. And that interview is still on our library YouTube channel when that book came out, which Andrew helped Christo Brand tell his story. And Christo was also white Afrikaners, grew up in that bubble, was Nelson Mandela's prison guard, and through that became a convert to ending apartheid. and was one of Nelson Mandela's converts to this and spreading that. And so I think that's a lot of important stories about that. Ethan.
John Carlin, the author of Playing the Enemy, which is a fantastic book about the 1995 Rugby World Cup that was made into the film Invictus. He calls Christo Brand Mandela's first white convert.
Okay, so yeah, so these ripples of effect that happen and people converted and change happens. That's the kind of heroes we need, the people who do this. And so I think this is a great thing. And thank you for, I was not aware of Rivonia's children or any of this until Ethan brought this to my attention. And I want to thank you for that. I hope this book goes on to have great success as it's published. And thank you, Glenn. And thank you, Andrew, for being over here from South Africa. I know you're doing other things as well, but making the time to visit us here at Princeton Public Library to talk to Glenn. And Glenn, thank you for coming from DC. And so, yeah, thank you.